Here's Jordan Peterson to explain what he means when he talks about God.
You say you believe in God. You have been...
No, I say I act as if he exists.
You say what?
I say I act as if he exists,
Okay,
which is a much more precise claim.
Okay.
You act as though who exists exactly? What do you think God is?
What in that? So, in what sense do you mean? What is the God that you act as though he, she, it exists? And what is the God-shaped thing I must have in my life to prevent me from being a quote real atheist?
Peterson has said that Sam is not an atheist in his actions, by which he specified that he doesn't rob banks and do stuff like that. Peterson seems to think that to feel naturally averse to harming other people is acting as though a God exists.
Okay, well, I'm going to read some things that I wrote because it's so complicated that I'm not sure that I can just spin it off the top of my head, and so you'll have to excuse me. And what I'm going to do is sort of paint a picture by highlighting different things. So now I already made one point here. I made the point that part of the conception of God that underlies the Western ethos is the notion that whatever God is expressed in the truthful speech that rectifies pathological hierarchies.
I'm not convinced that this is true, and I'm curious about how he came to this conclusion. Theism seems more like it has been used by the West as a means of justifying hierarchies rather than rectifying them, pathological or not.
That isn't all it does. It also confronts the chaos of being itself and generates habitable order. That's the metaphysical proposition, and that's best conceptualized as at least one element of God. And so I would think about it as a transcendent reality that's only observable across the longest of time frames, the longest of iterated time frames, to your point.
For how long a time frame has Jordan been observing Sam Harris's behavior? It must have been a while if it allowed him to conclude that Sam is not an atheist in his actions. And if God is only observable by looking at the longest of iterated time frames, then God has never been observed and can never be observed because the longest time frame is infinity.
So here's some propositions, and they're complicated, and they need to be unpacked. So I'm just going to read them, and that'll have to do for the time being. So God is how we imaginatively and collectively represent the existence and action of consciousness across time.
That sounds a lot like Hegel's conception of God. Did he lift that from Hegel, or is it a coincidence that he and Hegel had the same idea?
As the most real aspects of existence manifest themselves across the longest of time frames.
Most real? Either something is real or it isn't.
But are not necessarily apprehensible as objects in the here and now. So what that means in some sense is that you have conceptions of reality built into your biological and metaphysical structure that are a consequence of processes of evolution that occurred over unbelievably vast expanses of time, and that structure your perception of reality in ways that it wouldn't be structured if you only lived for the amount of time that you're going to live. And that's also part of the problem of deriving values from facts, because you're evanescent and you can't derive the right values from the facts that portray themselves to you in your lifespan, which is why you have a biological structure that's like 3.5 billion years old.
I don't see how you could derive values from facts, regardless of how long you have been collecting those facts.
So God is that which eternally dies and is reborn in the pursuit of higher being and truth.
What is higher being? Higher in what sense?
That's a fundamental element of hero mythology. God is the highest value in the hierarchy of values. That's another way of looking at it. God is what calls and what responds in the eternal call to adventure. God is the voice of conscience.
So when Peterson says that he acts as though God exists, is he merely acting as though these things which he lists exist, or does he believe these things exist? For example, does he merely act as though the voice of conscience exists, but does not necessarily believe that his conscience exists? The things he lists seem like things he actually thinks exist, rather than merely things he acts as though exist.
God is the source of judgment and mercy and guilt. God is the future to which we make sacrifices, and something akin to the transcendental repository of reputation. Here's a cool one if you're an evolutionary biologist. God is that which selects among men in the eternal hierarchy of men. So, men arrange themselves into hierarchies, and then men rise in the hierarchy. And there's principles that are important that determine the probability of their rise, and those principles aren't tyrannical power.
Then why is it so common for tyrants to get to the top of these hierarchies? Why is tyranny such an ever-present hazard if it does not increase one's probability of rising through the ranks of social hierarchies?
There's something like the ability to articulate truth and the ability to be competent and the ability to make appropriate moral judgments. And if you can do that in a given situation, then all the other men will vote you up the hierarchy, so to speak.
I'm very skeptical that this is the case. It doesn't seem at all to me like the ability to be competent and make appropriate moral judgments increases one's likelihood of being voted up many hierarchies. A lot of hierarchies, especially the steepest ones, seem to be buttressed by sycophancy and fear rather than reverence for competence. And since when does articulating the truth increase your odds of being elected up a hierarchy? It doesn't seem like the most honest people get anywhere near the top of the majority of hierarchies.
And that will radically increase your reproductive fitness, and the operation of that process across long expanses of time looks to me like it's codified in something like the notion of God the Father.
If that were true, then it seems much more intuitively the case that depictions of God the Father would be a lot thirstier rather than portraying him as a partnerless old man.
It's also the same thing that makes men attractive to women, because women peel off the top of the male hierarchy, and the question is what should be at the top of the hierarchy, and the answer right now is tyranny as part of the patriarchy, but the real answer is something more like the ability to use truthful speech in the service of, let's say, well-being. And so that's something that operates across tremendous expanses of time, and it plays a role in the selection for survival itself, which makes it a fundamental reality.
How does it make it a fundamental reality? Life isn't part of the most fundamental aspects of reality. Biology emerges from the elements of reality. How then could something which plays a role in the selection for survival itself therefore be a fundamental reality?
Jordan, can I just cut in here with one question?
Stop with that for now.
What... So I was not hearing in that list of attributes a God who could care if anyone masturbated. I was not hearing a God who...
Depends on what else is stopping you from doing, Sam.
Sorry, I missed that.
I said it depends on what else it's stopping you from doing.
Well, okay, so it's
yeah,
important to live.
But seriously.
It's important to do something other than masturbate.
Yes.
It's important to do something other than pray, but I've never heard a Christian try to suggest that praying is bad, much less that it's something God does not want you to do. What else it's stopping you from doing is clearly not the basis for Christian prohibitions.
Yes, which actually constitutes a problem for many people.
Which is harder than it sounds.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing a God, a personal God who can possibly hear anyone's prayers, much less answer them, right? And I'm wondering what percentage of religious people who would say, oh yeah, I believe in God and it's the most important thing in my life, what percentage of those religious people do you think have in mind a God of the sort you just described?
It's clear from the description of his concept of God that he does not believe that God is a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind like many Christian apologists claim he is. Jordan Peterson doesn't seem to regard God as a person. I don't have a problem with that, but what is frustrating to me, and also apparently Sam Harris, is that whenever Peterson is asked whether he believes in God, he is never straightforward about the fact that he clearly does not believe that God is a supernatural, immaterial person. Sometimes theists will call him out for this as well.
So people say to me, do you believe in God? And I think, okay, there's a couple of mysteries in that question. What do you mean do? What do you mean you? What do you mean believe? And what do you mean God? And you say as the questioner, well, we already know what all those things mean, except belief in God. And I think, no, if we're going to get down to the fundamental brass tacks, we don't really know what any of those things mean.
So one thing you mentioned in the book, you were talking about some psychological theory, which I don't forget. I forget what it is right now. But you mentioned something. You said there's, the problem with this such and such theory is that it doesn't have any evidence. Full stop. Categorical. All this, what you're doing now, you didn't mention that. You didn't say, well, it depends on what you mean by this. It depends on what sorry to say, But it depends on what you mean by this. It depends on what you mean. You become postmodern all of a sudden.
Peterson could save himself and everyone else a lot of frustration if he were to answer questions about God by being upfront about the fact that he does not believe in the kind of God most apologists and theologians believe in, and instead uses God as a metaphor for the things he earlier listed.
I don't know, Sam. It's a good question, because when I go talk to people, when I talk to people online and use exactly this terminology, millions of people listen.
Well, I listen too. That doesn't mean that I agree or that I even think that anything he says makes any sense. Whenever he's asked about God in most interviews, he pretends not to understand what the person asking wants to know. He's smart enough to understand that when most people ask him whether he believes in God, they want to know whether he believes in a supernatural, disembodied mind that created the universe. One can only speculate why it is that he doesn't come right out and say that he does not, in fact, believe in this specific conception of God. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.